It's the middle of the night, April 6, 1917. The U.S. Congress has been locked in debate for hours. The House chambers are filled with tension and smoke as exhausted lawmakers finally cast their votes. A hush falls as the tally is read. The United States is now at war with Germany. The gallery erupts, not in applause, but in emotion. This is Good Friday, and by Sunday, churches across America will gather to celebrate Easter, proclaiming the death and resurrection of Jesus. But pastors are going to step into pulpits and declare that now Americans must be willing to die for freedom. I'm Laura Lee Siemens, and this is the Church History Podcast. Welcome back to the Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Lee, and we're continuing our series, The Church at War. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be discussing World War I. It's the winter of 1871. In the glittering hall of mirrors and palaces of Versailles, the air is thick with pride. French chandeliers gleam overhead, marble walls echo with German voices, and as Prussian generals and princes stand shoulder to shoulder, a moment, centuries in the making, finally arrives. King Wilhelm I of Prussia steps forward. A hush falls. Otto von Bismarck, his iron-fisted chancellor, is nearby. His handiwork is complete. Wilhelm is declared Kaiser, the first emperor of a new, united Germany, and the world shifts. What was once a scattered puzzle of feuding duchies and forested kingdoms is now an empire. To understand the church during World War I, we have to go back centuries earlier to the rise of Protestantism, the splintering of Christendom, and the emergence of Germany as a nation. This is the story of how a fractured region of holy empires, religious wars, and revolutionary ideas transformed into one of the most powerful and dangerous forces the world has ever seen. Now, I have covered all these stories in past episodes, and I've also written about this time period in my two books, The Church is Born and The Church is Corrupted. You'll find links to those in the show notes. Long before Germany had a Kaiser, it had an emperor. The Holy Roman Empire was founded in 962, and it had for nearly 1,000 years, sprawling across Central Europe, this patchwork of duchies, free cities, prince-bishoprics, and kingdoms. Imagine a jigsaw puzzle where every single piece has its own language, laws, and religion. That was Germany before Germany. And yet there was one unifying force, the Catholic Church. The Pope owned the emperors, bishops ruled cities, and monasteries dotted the countryside. The church wasn't just a spiritual guide. The church was political. It was the culture, and it was often also the military. But then came Martin Luther. In 1517, the German monk nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, challenged the authority of the Pope, and what was supposed to be a scholarly debate sparked a wildfire. Princes who had long resented the power of Rome saw an opportunity. Some embraced Luther's theology. Others just saw land, wealth, and independence. And what followed was a spiritual earthquake, really, the Reformation. By the 1600s, Europe was soaked in the blood of religious wars. We had the 30-Year War, which devastated the German countryside. And when peace finally came in 1648, it brought a cold reality. No single church or denomination would reign supreme again. But the Holy Roman Empire limped on. Its days, however, were numbered. In 1806, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon crushed the last remnants of the empire and declared the Holy Roman Empire dissolved. Then came the French Revolution that exploded across the Rhine. The monarchy was toppled. The church in France was persecuted and exiled. Many murdered. And liberty, equality replaced crosses and creeds. In the German states, these revolutionary ideas stirred deep questions. What was the role of the church in the modern world? Was Christianity just a religious tradition? Or was it something worth dying for? Enlightenment thinkers flourished, secular nationalism gained momentum, and the spiritual foundation of Europe began to erode. In 1815, after Napoleon's defeat, European leaders gathered at the Congress of Vienna to restore order. Out of the ashes of the war, they created the German Confederation. It was a loose confederation of 39 states, and it was dominated by two powers, Austria and Prussia. But instead of unity, what came was a lot of rivalry. Then came Zollverein, a customs union led by Prussia. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. A customs union led by Prussia. Trade barriers fell. Railroads connected cities. And suddenly, Germans began to see themselves not as Bavarians or Saxons. They were Germans. In 1848, revolutions swept Europe. Liberal and national movements unified Germany. However, rulers in Austria would crush any uprising. And then, stepping onto the stage, was Otto von Bismarck. In just a few short years, he manipulated three important wars. The Danish War in 1864, which claimed territory. The Austro-Prussian War in 1866, which sidelined Austria. And then the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which rallied the southern German states. Victory after victory forged something no revolution could. Pride. Pride in a nation. And in 1871, with the French humiliated and Versailles occupied, Germany was born. The newly minted German Empire was a marvel. It was powerful and precise. Railroads crisscrossed the nations. Factories roared. Universities were producing engineers and philosophy. It seemed like overnight, Germany had become one of the world's greatest nations. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm II took the throne. He was brash and ambitious. He aspired to make Germany not just an empire, the empire, the world-ruling empire. He began building a navy to rival Britain, and he launched a colonial race against the powers. Germany began creating colonies across Africa. And after just 11 years after its founding, Germany was now a rival to Great Britain. The church, once the center of German life, now found itself sidelined. Catholics and Protestants alike had to compete with nationalism, secularism, and the state. Militarism grew, alliance tightened, old rivalries simmered, especially with France, who was bitter over the loss of land. By the early 20th century, Europe was a powder keg. The church watched, divided, nervous, and in some cases irrelevant, as the world drifted towards war. So how did the church respond when war finally came? That's where our journey begins. At the outbreak of World War I, the world's most powerful leaders weren't just political rivals, they were actually family. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all cousins, tied by blood to Queen Victoria, who was known as the grandmother of Europe. Their children played together. They exchanged personal letters. Yet when war came, those bonds shattered. And despite the web of royal marriages that connected nearly every European throne, national alliances and military pride proved stronger than family ties. But perhaps the deeper tragedy was not just political, but spiritual. Beyond royal bloodlines, another family was being torn apart. The church. Across Europe and beyond, Christian men fought against other Christian men. In German villages, mothers prayed for their sons. In English cathedrals, families wept in the candlelight. And in American pews, immigrants begged God to spare loved ones on both sides of the trenches. World War I wasn't just a world at war. It was family at war. It's June 28th, 1914. You've been handed the kind of assignment that make your hands shake at the wheel. You're driving the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Duchess Sophia. The morning is bright. Crowds line the street cheering and waving their flags. Flags flutter from windows. You glance in the rearview mirror. There they are, sitting tall in the open-topped car, trying to smile, but you see it in their faces. They're nervous, and so are you. You've just survived an assassination attempt. A bomb was thrown at your car. You saw it coming, dodged, and then it bounced off the folded roof and landed under the vehicle behind you. The explosion had ripped through the streets. Screams are still echoing in your ears. You looked back. You saw the blood, the smoke, the twisted metal. 16 people were injured. The Archduke had brushed himself off, shook with fury, then calmly gave his speech, blood-stained papers in his hand. Now, instead of waiting for a military escort, the Archduke insists on visiting the hospital to see the wounded. You nod and pull away from town hall, heading back through the city. But then, you take a wrong turn. This street isn't part of the official route. You realize the mistake too late. You try to back up, fumble with the gears, the engine groans, then stalls. The car comes to a complete stop. And that's when you see him. A young man, barely out of his teens, steps out of the crowd. You don't have time to shout. You just watch as he pulls out a pistol and raises it towards the car. Two shots. You hear the Duchess gasp. She falls. You turn. She's been hit in the abdomen. The Archduke reaches for her, his mouth open. Blood is already pouring down his collar. Another shot. He's hit in the neck. You sit frozen in shock. The silence after the shots is deafening. By noon, they're both dead. And though you couldn't have known in that moment, the bullets fired just feet from where you sat would set the world ablaze. A wrong turn, a stalled engine, a teenage boy, and 2 deaths. And that is the beginning of a war that would claim millions of lives. The shooting shocked Europe. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, and once Germany promised to stand with Austria-Hungary, they declared war on Serbia. Russia defended Serbia, and when Germany demanded that Russia back down, Russia refused. So Germany declared war on Russia. France, still angry at Germany, looked on anxiously, and they were right to do so. Germany had been waiting for a reason to attack France, and since France was an ally of Russia, this was the perfect opportunity. Germany planned on attacking France by marching through Belgium. Great Britain had promised Belgium that if Germany crossed the border, Great Britain would defend Belgium. And so, by August the 4th, Great Britain was involved in the war. The shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife had taken place on June 28th. 37 days later, on August the 4th, Great Britain was involved in the war. In just 37 days, the world had erupted into war. As war engulfed the world, pulpits across Europe preached patriotic conviction. In England, Anglican clergy blessed troops in the name of Christ and declared Britain's cause to be a righteous crusade. German pastors declared that the Kaiser's army were fighting for Christian civilization. Russian Orthodox priests stood on the Eastern Front, blessing troops, banners, and even bullets. In France, Catholic bishops affirmed the divine justice of their nation's military aims. It seemed that wherever a nation sent soldiers, the church marched beside them, convinced that God was on their side. Across the Atlantic in the White House, President Woodrow Wilson was staring at 2 battles, one in Europe and one at home. He had just lost his wife. Ellen Wilson, his partner and First Lady, had passed away from kidney disease on August 6, 1914, the very day he declared United States would remain neutral in the European conflict. Wilson, a former university president and a deeply introspective man, was in a state of grief, and in that grief he declared, "I will not send our young men to die for Europe. It is not our war." Despite the horrors emerging from Belgium, Wilson refused to be swayed. He knew the U.S. Army was small, its weapons were outdated, and its people were divided. Irish Americans were hesitant to side with Britain. German Americans feared turning on their homeland. Italian Americans watched nervously, unaware of where Italy would land. In a speech to Congress, Wilson implored Americans not just to remain neutral, but to think neutrally. Every man who loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality. Behind the scenes, he asked pastors to preach calm, peace, and restraint. And for a time, neutrality seemed to work. By October 1914, though battles raged in France, Belgium, America was booming. European armies needed supplies. They needed cotton, coal, corn, oil, and American factories delivered. The war may have been foreign, but business was a local. Even Wilson's ban on American banks loaning to warring nations quickly faded. With a booming economy and a nation focused inward, it seemed that the president's peace strategy could hold. But peace is fragile. Imagine it's February 1915. You're the captain of the SS Wilhelmina, the American freighter hauling food to Germany. 2,000 tons of it. Corn, beef, fruit. This is a legal shipment. It's non-military. You're neutral, and that is your protection. Until you reach British waters. A storm forces you to seek shelter in England. And before your boots are dry, British customs officers board your ship, and they seize your cargo. Germany, they say, has nationalized its grain supply, meaning your food now counts as military material. It's contraband, subject to blockade. You protest, but it's no use. The cargo is gone, the profits are gone, and the war, it seems, has no respect for neutrality. The British blockade of Germany tightened. Then Germany responded with submarines, U-boats patrolling the seas, sinking supply ships headed to Britain. For Americans, supplying both sides of the war became a deadly game. And on May 7th, 1915, the game changed. The RMS Lusitania, a passenger ship bound for Liverpool, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. It sank in 18 minutes, nearly 1,500 dead, including 128 Americans. Germany insisted the ship was carrying arms. Britain denied it, but the loss of American lives pushed Wilson to act. He issued a stern warning to Germany. More attacks would be seen as deliberately unfriendly. Then came the Arabic, which was torpedoed in August of 1915, and 3 more Americans died. Privately, Wilson was furious, but publicly, he still preached peace. In late 1915, the auto tycoon Henry Ford embarked on a self-proclaimed peace ship. He would broker ceasefire in Europe. But the effort failed, and Henry Ford came home humiliated. But Wilson remained determined to keep America out, especially with re-election looming in 1916. But he decided to take precautions. $91 million spent on military expansion, shipbuilding programs, army recruitment, all under the banner of preparedness, but hopeful for peace. It's just after midnight, July 30th, 1916. You're lying awake in your small apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The city is restless tonight. Hot, humid, kind of summer heat that sticks to your skin and keeps you from sleeping. You're staring at the ceiling, listening to the dull hum of distant traffic and the occasional rattle of a streetcar. And then your bed jolts. The windows rattle so hard you think that they've blown in. Then another explosion. Louder, closer. The walls tremble. Dishes crash to the floor. You bolt upright, heart pounding. You think it's an earthquake. Or worse, you stumble to the window and look out. In the distance, over the Hudson, you see it. Orange flames rising into the night sky. Then a sound like thunder rolling straight through your chest. Another blast. It feels like the whole city is coming apart at the seams. You run into the hallway, joining other neighbors in robes and nightclothes, all shouting the same thing. The war has come to America. Someone says the dock has been hit. Another says it's German saboteurs. You don't know what to believe, but when you finally gather the courage to go outside, you see the truth with your own eyes. Shattered glass litters the sidewalk. Shop windows are blown in. Across the river, Black Tom Island is on fire. The munition stockpile for the Allied war effort are exploding like fireworks. Later, you're going to learn that over 2 million pounds of TNT and artillery shells have gone off. The shockwave shattered thousands of windows across the city. It cracked the walls of Ellis Island and even threw debris into the arms of the Statue of Liberty, damaging the torch. 4 people are killed. The property damage is immense. And when the fires finally die down, the question everyone is asking is the same. Who did this? The government says that they can trace it back to German agents, part of a sabotage campaign targeting American supplies headed to Britain and France. But there's no proof, no arrests, no trials. But across America, there's whispers and rising suspicion against Germans. Soon, German Americans in your neighborhood will stop speaking German in public. A local baker finds his windows have been smashed. A church down the block is vandalized. Your friend's father, a teacher born in Hamburg, is asked to resign from his school. And it's not just New York. Weeks earlier, a bomb exploded at the Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco. That bomb killed 10 and wounded dozens. There's no clear culprit there either, but people are blaming Germans. Here in your apartment, staring out at the scarred skyline, it doesn't matter if the evidence is thin. This and other violent events are going to be blamed on German agents. And it's creating something new across the country. A fearful atmosphere for German Americans, and a sense that maybe peace is not going to hold. January 17th, 1917, British code breakers in room 40 intercept a message. It's from Germany's foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German ambassador in Mexico. It reads like a madman's offer. If the U.S. joins the war, Germany wants Mexico to invade the United States, promising the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico as a reward. The British hand the decoded message to Wilson. The American public sees it weeks later, and the tide turns. In the spring of 1917, Congress is voting on whether the United States should enter the war. It's Easter weekend, a time when Christians reflect on Christ's sacrifice. And now, some pastors are saying that to follow Jesus means laying down your life for your country. It's Easter Sunday, 1917. You arrive at church like you always do, dressed in your best, hat in hand, shoes polished. But this morning, the air feels heavy. The pews are full, but there's a hush over the congregation. Everyone has heard the news. On Friday, as Christians were remembering the death of Christ, President Wilson stood before Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And yesterday, the Senate approved it. And today, the House will vote. The United States is going to war. And now as you sit under the stained glass windows, watching light dance across the wooden floors, you wonder, what does this mean for the church? When the choir stands to sing, it's not Amazing Grace or Christ the Lord is Risen Today. It's the battle hymn of the Republic. We know it well. It was written during Civil War, but it has recently been added to the church hymnal, and it takes on new meaning now. The words strike deeper. This hymn isn't just about battles past. It's about today, about the war your nation is entering, about the spiritual war being preached from pulpits across America. This morning, your pastor's voice trembles slightly as he preaches, but it's not with fear, it's with conviction. Jesus died for our freedom, he says. And then with a pause and with passion, let us be ready to die for freedom. It's a phrase you're starting to hear more and more, spoken by politicians and echoed in Sunday sermons. You're told that to fight is to follow Christ, that freedom and democracy are sacred, and that this war is righteous. It stirs you and also unsettles you, because something else is rising from this patriotic fever. Suspicion, fear, and a whisper that maybe not everyone in the pews of your church is loyal. Some of the people in your pews speak with German accents or have German surnames, and you wonder, are they truly American? As you sing, you catch a glance from across the aisle, a German-American family who's attended your church for years. Their faces are quiet, and they seem withdrawn. You realize the war has not just come to America, it's come to your church. In the weeks to come, you see a growing division. German language Bibles quietly disappear from the back of the sanctuary. Longtime members leave. They haven't been asked to leave, but they don't feel comfortable in the church anymore. Pastors wrestle with sermons that glorify battle while still wanting to preach peace. The vote in Congress is only the beginning. The real battle of hearts, loyalties, and faith has started. This was the prevailing sentiment among the English congregation. For the German congregation, the feeling was similar and yet very different. Imagine you're a German Christian heading to church. You slip into your usual spot, the third pew on the right. It's where you sat every Sunday morning for the past 10 years, ever since you and your husband came to America to start a new life. Your children, 3 of them now, were all born here. They sit beside you in stiff Sunday clothes. You smooth your daughter's braids, take a breath, and look around the sanctuary. The same stained glass, the same hymns, but something is different. You can feel it before the first note is sung. Your best friend is sitting across the aisle. You've shared years of prayers, potlucks, and even wept together at the start of the war, praying for your brother and nephews who are back in Germany, forced to fight for a war they never asked for. But today, she doesn't even look at you, not once. Her son has been drafted and sent overseas. And now, maybe, he will face your brother, your nephews in battle. Your nephew might fire the shot that ends his life, or maybe the other way around. The weight of that knowledge is the silence between you. Since America declared war, everything has changed. Your husband changed the name of his restaurant, so it wouldn't sound German. Even sauerkraut had to go. It's called Liberty Cabbage now. Doesn't taste any different, but maybe, just maybe, it'll stop someone from throwing a brick through your window. You stopped reading the German newspaper last month. It folded anyway. No one would advertise with it. It doesn't matter that's been around for years. America doesn't want German voices, not even those who call this country home. Because while America is your home, your blood is German, and you wonder now, can those two things coexist? Your pastor tries to walk a delicate line. He preaches about unity, about peace. But as you sit there in the pews, you begin to know the church is choosing sides. Then comes the news. April 4th, 1918, in Illinois, a German-American Christian coal miner named Robert Pager is lynched by a mob. The men drag him from his home late at night, wrap him in an American flag, and parade him down the main street like a trophy. The police tried to protect him. The mayor tried to calm the crowd, but nothing could stop the frenzy. The police take Robert from the mob and hide him under the mayor's protection at City Hall. But the mob broke into City Hall to find him. And they found him in the basement of the City Hall, where he was hiding and praying. They marched him out to a bluff, let him scribble a goodbye letter to his parents, then asked if he had any last words. He dropped to his knees and prayed in German. When he stood, they put a rope around his neck and hung him from a lone hackberry tree. The trial came and went. The jury took 10 minutes. Not guilty. One juror said, "At least now no one can accuse us of being traitors." And Robert Pager wasn't the only one. In Kansas, a group called the Night Riders terrorized German-speaking towns. In Iowa, the governor banned the public use of German. Montana outlawed it for 2 years, and Pennsylvania tried to ban it completely. Schools dropped German from the curricula. Books were pulled from shelves, even burned. German churches went silent. Families changed their names, their recipes, their language, all to prove something, to prove that they were American. Even dog breeds weren't safe. The Dachshund became Dodger dogs, and beer, so closely tied to German immigrants, became suspect, and prohibitionists exploited the anti-German sentiment to advance their cause, portraying breweries as havens for traitors. And for the mother, sitting in the pews, she begins to wonder if there's still a place for her family here, in her church, in her neighborhood, in her country. During World War I, the Catholic Church, under the leadership of Pope Benedict XV, stood apart from the clamor of war and refused to choose sides. From the very beginning of the conflict, Benedict called the war the suicide of Europe and worked tirelessly for peace. He urged for a Christmas truce in 1914. He remained strictly neutral. The Pope focused instead on humanitarian relief. In 1917, he proposed a 7-point peace plan, which the major powers ignored. The churches in Germany, both Protestant and Catholic, stood firmly alongside the state. They offered prayers, propaganda, and moral backing to a nation at war. Protestant churches viewed themselves not only as a religious institution, they were guardians of German culture and unity. From pulpits across the country, pastors invoked the name of God in support of the Kaiser's war aims. They encouraged believers to see their sacrifice on the battlefield as a sacred duty. Chaplains traveled with the troops, offering communion and comfort in the muddy trenches of the Western Front. Sermons and church bulletins framed the conflict as a spiritual struggle, urging faith, endurance, and loyalty to the fatherland. In Russia, the Orthodox Church stood as a powerful symbol of national unity and spiritual strength in the Russian Empire. Deeply entwined with the Tsar's regime, the church was both a religious and a political pillar. It offered prayers for victory and framed the war as a sacred mission for Holy Russia. Clergy preached patriotism from the pulpits. They blessed soldiers. They mobilized communities to care for the wounded and the displaced. But the sacred bond between altar and throne shattered. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which swept away the monarchy, and with it, the church's protection and privileges. The Bolsheviks, rising to power later that year, brought in an aggressive atheist agenda. Church lands were seized, clergy were imprisoned and killed, cathedrals were closed or destroyed. Once the soul of Russia wartime morale, the Orthodox Church became a hunted institution. Its support for the Tsar's war effort making it an enemy in the eyes of the new Soviet state. In the end, the collapse of the church's authority paralleled the collapse of Russia's war effort itself, as both faith and empire crumbled under the weight of a revolution. The church in England was a powerful voice in rallying British support for the war. It blended patriotic fervor with spiritual authority. Once Germany invaded Belgium in August of 1914, the church swiftly abandoned any neutrality. From pulpits across the country, clergy declared the war was a righteous cause, a battle of right against might. Sermons declared it as a holy war, and congregations were singing onward Christian soldiers with renewed zeal. Bishops like Arthur Wington Ingram urged young men to enlist, calling on them to defend justice and save Belgium. Anglican chaplains followed the troops into the trenches, bringing communion to the front lines, comforting the dying, and conducting services in the mud and blood of no man's land. Back home, churches organized aid for the wounded, visited grieving families, and led national prayers of mourning. They became places of mourning and meaning as nearly 1 million British lives are lost. Yet not all the voices within the church rang with the same uncritical patriotism. Leaders like the Archbishop of Canterbury, Randall Davidson, urged compassion. In time, the church's unwavering support for the war would draw criticism. Some argued it was aligned too closely with state propaganda, and it failed to fully grasp the horrors faced by men in the trenches. In every country, on all sides of the war changed the church itself. The absence of so many men from pews and pulpits led to a rise in female participation in what some historians have called the feminization of the church. While at first President Wilson had urged caution in 1914 with his neutrality proclamation, he had asked Americans to stay calm and silent, especially in churches. But by 1917, that tone had changed, and now the ministers were expected to stir up passion, loyalty, and sacrifices. Churches weren't necessarily forced into the role, but they were greatly encouraged. War bond drives were held in churches. Flags were hung in pulpits for the first time. Hymnals were updated to include patriotic songs. Denominations distributed sermons praising the war effort. Liberty Bond Sundays saw preachers not only urging donations, but personally buying bonds at the end of the service. The federal government didn't pass any laws forcing pastors to preach for the war. They didn't need to. The pressure came from within, the self-mobilization of the church. But not every denomination marched in line with national flags. The historic peace churches like the Mennonites and Quakers refused to promote the war, emphasizing the teachings of Jesus as nonviolent. Members were harassed, surveilled, and accusations of being disloyal. Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned. State defense councils investigated pastors who refused to preach war sermons. Congregants demanded patriotism from their clergy, and a minister who preached on resurrection instead of military service might face questions, or worse, when shaking hands at the church door. And still, countless pastors simply carried on. They preached the gospel, they taught Sunday school, they served their congregation as faithfully as they could, while the world outside raged with conflict. But few newspapers quoted those sermons. Few historians recorded those Sunday mornings, when nothing extraordinary happened. In April 1917, just days after the United States entered World War I, President Wilson established the Committee for Public Information. This was a government propaganda agency designed to sell the war to the American people. It was led by journalist George Creel. The committee worked not through force, but through persuasion, using the tools of advertising, news, media, art, film, and public speaking to stir patriotic fever across the country. Their mission was to unify the public beyond the war effort, and no space was off limits, including the church. Through the committee's influence, thousands of sermons were written by government-appointed authors and sent to pastors across the country, urging them to preach patriotism from the pulpit. Sunday school materials were published by the government, designed to install loyalty to America's cause in the minds of children. Some churches willingly participated, viewing this partnership as a way to serve both God and country. They preached the recommended sermons, distributed the official Sunday school pamphlets, and even welcomed 4-minute men to stand in the pulpits and encourage young men to enlist and sell Liberty bonds. But not all churches complied. Many clergy saw this intrusion as intolerable, outraged by what they saw as a government overreach into sacred spaces. Those pastors refused to preach government-authored messages or to allow their Sunday school rooms to become training grounds for state ideology. These dissenting voices warned that the line between faith and politics was being dangerously blurred. But the committee's reach was vast. It monitored immigrant newspapers, shut down German language publications, flooded communities with patriotic posters and slogans. In churches, schools, theaters, street corners, the Committee for Public Information sought to weld the nation into a one unified body ready to fight. But in doing so, it raised troubling questions about the lines of persuasion, the freedom of the pulpit, and the cost of loyalty in the time of war. It's November 11th, 1918, 10 o'clock in the morning. You're sitting on the train bench, your knapsack at your feet. You're still picturing what you saw when you saw it, your name in print in the newspaper, drafted. Just a few days ago, you heard cheers in the streets and someone shouting that the war was over. People danced, church bells rang, you believed it, you let yourself believe it. And then the truth followed like a cold wind. It was only a rumor. And now you've been drafted. You're headed towards basic training, trying to swallow the fear burning in your throat. From what you've heard, 6 weeks is all you get. Then it's off to the trenches. You stare out the window as the town fades from view, your little brother's face blurring into the trees, your mother waving, and you wonder if you're ever going to see them again. Then suddenly the train groans and slows and stops. You're in the middle of nowhere. Fields, hills, silence. Confused murmurs rise in the car. Then the door bursts open and somebody yells, "Get out! You've got to hear this!" You step onto the gravel with the others, heart thudding. Then the shouting turns to cheers, hats flying into the air. The war is over, someone yells. And this time, it's real. It's 11 o'clock a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, and the war has officially ended. You're saved. You won't be crossing the Atlantic. You won't be crawling through mud or praying in a foxhole. But even as you celebrate, there's a shadow over it all. Word spreads that men still died that morning. Thousands of young soldiers went over the top just hours ago, even though the armistice had already been agreed to. Also, the leaders could end at a perfect symbolic moment of 11-11-11. And though the guns were silent, there were still more battles raging. Not fought with bullets, but with blame. Germany, defeated and exhausted, is forced to carry the full weight of the war. The Allies all declare it's Germany's fault. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, makes it official. Germany must not only admit responsibility, but pay for it. Over £6 billion in reparations. They lose vital territories, and they are stripped of their military. Land goes back to France. Parts of Germany are handed to Poland, Denmark, and Belgium. Its colonies are all taken. Its army is cut down to just a fraction. No tanks, no planes, no submarines. The Rhineland is demilitarized and under foreign watch. The war is over, but the wounds fester. In Germany, rage and humiliation simmer. Red lines grow longer. Political riots shake the streets. The people are crushed under the weight of this, and they will not forget. And one day, bitterness will rise again. The German leadership needs someone to blame. They can't take the blame. So they claim they lost the war because of spies and traitors living in Germany, a group of people not loyal to Germany, a separate nation inside Germany, the Jews. And the bitterness towards the Jewish people begins to grow as Germans blame them for the fall of their great nation. And that will lead the church in Germany to another crisis, which we will cover in later episodes. Across cities and countryside from London to Berlin, from Kansas to Krakow, the quiet that followed the guns was filled with grief. An estimated 15 to 22 million lost their lives in the Great War. And of those, roughly 9 to 11 million were soldiers, young men cut down in the trenches, in the mud, in the final chances of a war that seemed to devour an entire generation. Civilian deaths ranged from 6 to 13 million, innocent lives lost to shelling, starvation, and disease. And then came something worse. In the final year of the war, the Spanish flu swept across the globe like a second, invisible war. Within months, it infected an estimated 500 million people, about 1/3 of the world's population at the time. At least 50 million people died. Some experts believe the true number could even be as high as 100 million. In the United States alone, 675,000 lives were lost. It killed more people than the war, and it did so in homes, schools, churches, and military barracks. In the midst of all of this, the church faced one of the greatest challenges in its history. Church leaders found themselves stepping into the roles that they hadn't really fully prepared for: grief counselors, public health advocates, spiritual guides for shattered communities. In every congregation, there were those who came in tears, desperate for comfort and answers. For some, tragedy drove them towards God. They filled the pews, clutching their Bibles. They lit candles. They prayed over names etched in memorial plaques. They found solace in the suffering Savior, one who understood their wounds, who wept, and who promised a resurrection. But others came in anger, if they came at all. How could God be real in a world so cruel? Why had he allowed so much death? Why had their sons, their husbands, their mothers been taken? Why hadn't he stopped it? Pastors and priests are grieving themselves, and they stand in the gap trying to hold together faith and sorrow, community and confusion. Some offer languages of lament, teaching their congregation how to grieve with hope. Others listen because there's really no easy answers. The church itself is wounded. In Europe, in North America, all over the globe, the trauma of war and the plague tore at the very foundations of faith. But it also forced a reckoning. What does it mean to believe in a God of love after such violence? And the question came, could faith survive the trenches? This was a time of pain and a time of healing. For many, the church became a hospital for the soul, a place to bring trauma. And though faith itself had been shaken, it had not been destroyed. The world had changed forever, and so had the church. The word Christendom, originated in the 9th century, originally meant the state of being a Christian. However, by the Middle Ages, it had come to represent something more powerful, a political and spiritual empire of Christian nations, united by faith and governed by a divine right. And on the eve of war, this vision had still held sway. In Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the British empires all had seen themselves as pillars of Christendom, where church and state were closely intertwined. But by the time the war ended, that unity had crumbled. When the guns fell silent, so did the old order. The great Christian empires collapsed, and in their place rose secular republics, skeptical of religion, untrusting of monarchy, and hungry for new ideologies. So, here's the question. How did the church respond during World War I? And the truth is, there's no one way to answer this, and there's no simple answer. And anyone who says otherwise is probably quoting selectively. Historians face major obstacles here. Sermons were rarely recorded. Denominational records often overlooked any ordinary in favor of dramatic. Most historian books rely on sensationalist reports from the New York Times or quotes from prominent pastors who supported the war. And any preacher calling for peace and not war in America would have gotten in trouble with the law, and so those sermons would not have been published. The most widely cited book on American religion in World War I is Preachers Present Arms by Ray Adams, and he cherry-picked the loudest, most military voices and strung them together to paint a picture of total church participation. But that's not the whole story, because it leaves out the pastors who preached only on Easter and not on Empire. It ignores denominations that called for separation between the church and state, even in wartime. And it buries the ordinary, faithful ministries that didn't make headlines. So what did the church do during World War I? Some churches supported the war with political zeal. Some resisted with principled conviction. Some simply tried to shepherd their people through unimaginable loss. And the story of the church at World War I isn't simple. It's not singular. And it's certainly not settled. One historian put it this way: the church supported the war, except for those who didn't. One thing I didn't talk about in this episode was the Ottoman Empire. And the reason I didn't mention that empire during this episode is because that over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire during World War I and tell the story of one 14-year-old girl who was hunted by the Muslim Ottoman Empire because she was a Christian. And let me tell you, you don't want to miss her story. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at lauraleesiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.